Right, so this is a suggestion via Patreon. The name of the video is A Day in the Life of a White Slave in the Ottoman Empire. All right, let's get it.
The Ottoman Empire is one of the largest and longest running empires in history, spanning 623 years.
And I'm going to be honest, guys, it's still maybe moving around in the Middle East, but not as like in your face, but there are still like open air markets in like Libya type of thing, guys. Mauritania is also extremely troubling, guys. South of Morocco, guys.
From 1299
right
to
now.
1922. And 3 continents, including the Balkans in southeastern Europe, Arabia and Central Asia, and coastal northern Africa. Like many great empires that came before it, the Ottoman Empire was based on slavery. But unlike most examples of slavery, in the Ottoman Empire, slaves were white. The Ottoman slave trade spanned the entirety of the empire's existence, even after attempted abolishments in the late 19th century. Particularly during the earlier centuries of the empire, slaves were taken during war raids or politically organized expeditions ordered by the Sultan across southern and eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Caucasus.
Yeah.
With a large...
Mostly the Balkans and the Caucasus, though, guys. Right? And this is where... I mean, I get it. Some people have no distinction on what the concept of, I guess, whiteness is, right? A lot of people from the Caucasus would probably have to write that they were not white in America, like down on the list, guys. Just keep that in mind. And that's what always kind of stood out to me as like a weird thing. Like, why do you guys use that word, of all things, guys? Because a lot of people that are from that region literally look nothing like what we in America would consider white, I guess, guys. But yeah, I would say that most of the Ottoman Empire was probably built up more so of the Balkans and the Caucasus.
Across southern and eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Caucasus, with a large percentage shipped to the capital Constantinople, nowadays known as Istanbul. And later, from the 16th to 19th centuries, a huge number of Europeans, hundreds of thousands, were captured by Barbary pirates and sold as slaves to the Ottoman Empire, although the Ottomans themselves did not participate in these raids.
Mm-hmm.
It's estimated at its heights, 1 in 5 residents of Constantinople were slaves, which was not dissimilar to the Roman Empire the Ottomans replaced.
Right, they replaced them, yeah.
This is the largest example of white slavery in history, although comparatively lesser study has been done on this than the African-American slave trade. But
it's about numbers, that's probably why.
Comparatively lesser study has been done on this than the African-American slave trade. But
because to my knowledge, like both of them have pretty much been studied drastically, right? To the point where I've learned about this a long time ago. Like this very specific thing, the Ottoman Empire was wild, guys. I would say that was probably the first like time in history where it became like a business, guys, right? So keep that in mind. Like it was on par with the chattel slavery version that we had in the United States, guys. It is on par with that, but I think they may have been. No, I think the chattel slavery was more barbaric. Because I think they allowed the Ottoman Empire basically allowed people to still, for example, if you had a kid, that kid was not a slave. The kid was free. It had nothing to do with that, right? It had all to do with that one person versus chattel slavery, where one person. Where if the kid was born, that kid would be owned instantly. But all right, let's get it.
Much like the infamous Christian Crusades led by kings like Richard the Lionheart, who journeyed across Europe to forcefully convert people to Christianity and take over their land, the Ottoman Empire did much the same.
Well, those
but was
onion hats
Muslim
were
led,
crazy.
and instead captured Eastern Europeans and young Christian boys to convert them and enlist them in a special branch of the Ottoman army known as the Janissaries.
Right.
More on them later. And although religion and payback played their own part in the Ottoman raids, financial reasons provided a far greater motive for enslaving those from conquered countries. At least we can conclude we're all as bad as each other. Most sources available on slavery in the Ottoman Empire comes from white, Christians, Western Europeans, and those removed from the actual empire's existence.
Right.
As such, we cannot qualify the accuracy of these accounts, being that they are told through the lens of people who did not experience the empire themselves and have many cultural biases in their reporting.
Absolutely.
A few accounts
Great.
from within the empire give us some rare insights into how slavery was viewed through the lens of the Ottomans themselves. First, it's important to know that Muslims held a very different view on slavery to other nations and religions involved in slave trades. The Quran suggests that slaves should be treated with kindness and encourages manumission, freedom of slaves who have proved their loyalty. The Quran also teaches that slaves are of equal moral standing to their masters, but lower legal status, and not legally differentiated by their skin color. Despite this,
And that was the difference. I think so. A lot of it wasn't based off of the color of your skin. A lot of it was just purely, oh, those other guys over there need some conquering. That's really what that was, right? Oh, they have this land. I kind of want that land. Let's just conquer all of them and make all the women concubines and make them work within a harem and make all the men part of the janissaries and basically turn them all into eunuchs and things like that. I think probably the basis of the Unsullied from Game of Thrones, guys.
though, those
Most
with
likely,
disabilities and
guys.
darker skin tones, coming from the sub-Saharan regions of Africa, often sold for a much smaller price than their fit, healthy, and white counterparts.
That's an interesting choice of words you just used there, sir.
Often sold for a much smaller price than their fit, healthy, and white counterparts. All Ottoman slaves were expensive, usually owned by high-ranking officials who paid the most for virginal European girls aged between 13 and 25 and healthy teenage boys. But despite their expense, court records have shown that it wasn't just high-ranking officials who owned slaves. They were widespread in Ottoman society and worked domestically, agriculturally, in trade and in the military, or forced into sexual slavery. White women held positions in the household, usually seeing to higher profile tasks around the home and caring for the ladies of the house, in contrast to their African counterparts who usually received the more menial of tasks. Meanwhile, the men often worked as laborers or farmhands. Domestic and labor slaves rarely remained slaves their whole lives and could use their years in slavery to socially mobilize themselves. Further court records show that citizens of the Ottoman Empire lived by certain Islamic ideals with regards to slavery, and that they often freed their slaves upon their, the master's, deaths, or, in many cases, before. Many experienced slavery for around 7 years if they were black, and 9 years if they were white, to prove their loyalty before they were freed and usually moved up the ladder in their field of work to become foremen or overseers, where they would become slaves with contracts, clients of their former masters, and receive wages. Evidence from Sharia court records showed these newly freed slaves were usually readily and willingly accepted into Ottoman society, particularly in smaller towns, and enjoyed a large degree of economic and social independence. Let's talk about the darker part of slavery in the Ottoman Empire, because slavery in general isn't dark enough: the slave trade. The slave trade in the Ottoman Empire can be divided into two categories: young girls taken during war raids or sold to slavery by their impoverished families, and those who resided in the imperial harem. The lesser fortunate female slaves were expected to be freely sexually available to their male master, although not the husband of a female master, and often lived in part of a harem. But they did have certain rights not afforded to other women in slavery. Lucky them. If a harem slave were to find herself pregnant, she could not be sold into further slavery
And
and
the
would be
kid wouldn't
freed
be.
upon her master's death. And any child was born free and could not be sold or
Yeah.
given away. Young boys were also victims of slavery, although they usually worked
Yeah.
in bathhouses or coffee houses.
Yeah.
What made
What's funny about, well, not really funny about this, but like the interesting part of like this very specific thing is that I've always kind of wondered, right? Like in the society as kind of closed off as a lot of the Middle East is in terms of like conservativeness, right? Where they're around men all day long and they do absolutely terrible things to guys who kind of like guys publicly. There's so many issues with young boys, right? Like in these bathhouses and these coffee houses. Pakistan is one of these places where, for example, Pakistan is still right now one of these places where young boys, they get kind of ran through, guys, right, by other men, in a place where you're not supposed to do this, but it happens so often. It's like, bro, what do you might as well just be okay with it, man on man relationships. You might as well just be okay with it, because how you're acting about it, bro. leave the kids back doors alone, guys. Right? All right. If you want to be with a man, bro, be with a grown man. Leave his kids alone, bro. Period. And I can tell you right now, this still happens right now in the Middle East, and I'm guessing a lot of it is because they're so segregated and separated, right? Shaking hands with a woman may be inappropriate because you're touching her, or hugging a woman may be inappropriate because you're touching her, and things like that. So all you can do for another human thing is a boy, guys. Afghanistan is like that also, guys. Keep that in mind. Like I'm telling you. The culture dictates that you can't have any type of human, anything until you're married, right? But you're absolutely desecrating the back door of these little boys, bro. For what? It seems like there may be an issue with the culture. There may be an issue with the culture if these kids are being, manhandled in the way that they are, guys.
Slavery, although they usually worked in bathhouses or coffee houses. What may seem strange to modern-day sensibilities is that being sold into sexual slavery wasn't necessarily considered a bad thing. In fact, although many were tragically sold out of desperation and poverty, even more were sold with the intention of utilizing the upward social mobility that came with a position as a slave, especially if you managed to secure a position in the imperial harem. Most sources regarding the imperial harem are sensationalist, written with a high degree of exaggeration and not much proof of the truths behind the tales, particularly in the case of Western writers. This is because many Ottoman citizens themselves did not know of the goings-on in the imperial harem, with all those contained within kept separate from society and sworn to silence of its secrets.
I can imagine.
Slaves within the imperial harem, known as concubines, used their position for social mobility, and often had greater freedom and luxuries than many free people. They were guarded 24/7 by black eunuch slaves and enjoyed positions of power, the ability to become wed to a high-ranking official, or even one of the sultan's wives, whereby, particularly in the period 1533 to 1636, they wielded great political power, having the ears of many influential men. However, they were still slaves, forced, however visually willingly, to submit to the men around them whenever they desired, and without choice of their suitor. Limited sources suggest very few harem slaves were ever freed from their concubine positions. Let's go back to the 14th century and the young boys who served in the Ottoman military branch, the Janissaries. The Janissaries were young boys taken as blood tax, or divshirme, at the end of battles and assimilated into the elite Ottoman army. Their taking was justified by the Sultan as part of the Islamic law that said the Sultan was entitled to 1/5 of booty collected in battle, beginning with the third Sultan Murad I, who believed humans were a valid part of this booty. After their capture, the boys were forcibly circumcised, converted to Islam, and became part of an intense slave soldier regiment where they were subjected to extreme discipline, becoming highly focused elite soldiers. The Janissaries were forbidden to grow beards or marry before aged 40, and expected to show complete and utter loyalty to the emperor. They received wages, were supported in battle, and became one of the first regiments to train in the use of firearms in the later centuries of the empire. In some cases, officials were even bribed by parents to take their children in the hopes of improving their socio-economic status. By the 1600s, the need for Janissary troops outweighed the number of boys drafted, and divshirme-only conscription to the Janissaries was abolished, allowing freeborn Muslims to join their ranks and capitalize on the potential to improve their socio-economic status.
Yeah, guys, they had to pay them, though. Right. And it was crazy because during this time, this shift in history, they had to firstly get paid now. And yeah, did it lift them up from poverty? Absolutely it did. Right. And also keep in mind, they could still have no family. They still had to go through all the other rules that were set in place by the other children soldiers, guys.
White slavery in the Ottoman Empire is not as black and white, pun not intended, as it seems in other areas and periods of time. Our lack of sources paints an incomplete picture of slavery and how slaves were treated in the empire, but what we do know creates a multifaceted and not wholly negative picture, as it does in the transatlantic slave trade.
Nah, bro, all of it is negative. All of it. the transatlantic situation was terrible. This one here was also equally terrible. The Ottoman the Ottoman trade was wild. A lot of things are being left out of it, but I understand. YouTube is interesting these days, guys, right? But again, I know that historically, I know at least from school that I know that a lot of these people that were brought into the Ottoman Empire did come from the Balkans and the Caucasus, but more so the Caucasus, right? A lot of them were like Turkish guys, for example. A lot of them were Turkish people. But then the ones that were more prized were the ones that came from Europe, right? Like, for example, and there's a reason for that. These people were taken because they were sitting on land that the Ottomans wanted, bro. We're going to run into your village. We're going to take you and sell you. Like, for example, guys, so my wife is extremely fair-skinned. She is from Granada, Spain, right? And so we would go to Morocco pretty often because it's a super, easy trip to make. It's a really easy trip to make, just to, get to another continent really quickly. And one of these times, this guy, right, from this region, historically from this region, was asking to purchase my wife, right, for a couple of camels. And I'm like, bro, what would I want a camel for, right? I don't need your camel, and you're not going to have my wife neither, right? Keep your camels. It was like 7 camels or something. I can't explain. Listen, right? And it's because, she's extremely, extremely fair-skinned, almost to the point where she looks white, right? But she is in fact Moroccan and Spanish, right? I think her mother is darker skinned than my mother is, right? But yeah, either way, guys, listen. You guys all have an absolutely amazing day and enjoy your day thoroughly.